I've clicked onto the global tropical overview for August the 25th, 2023. As is always the case in these videos, the thoughts expressed here are mine alone, and when making decisions ahead of any tropical cyclones, especially ahead of Typhoon Saola near the Philippines, please look towards your local weather office, local emergency management, and local tropical cyclone warning center. They're going to have the best information for your local area. I'm just going to give a big picture of what's going on. So we're going to start in the West Pacific today as we have a significant, even major typhoon threat with Typhoon Saola. Just a very, very quick mention of Tropical Storm Damrey here. This is forecast to move northwest and could become a typhoon before it recurves, forecast to recurve before it makes it to Japan. So we're not really concerned about too many impacts there. We also have Invest 93W here near the Mariana Islands, and this system will be tracking northwest over the coming days and is likely to develop and could become a significant typhoon in its own right after Saola. But we're going to mainly talk today about Saola, as this is a rapidly intensifying, at least quickly intensifying, typhoon near Luzon, and this is forecast to be a powerful storm over the next 5 days at least, and we're talking about potential major impacts of a potential strong to super typhoon for the Philippines and Taiwan. So this is the current satellite loop, and what you'll notice is we have a lot of deep convection continuously firing around the center of circulation. I'll pause it at the end here, and you can see the center is probably about here in the middle of this convection. What's likely happening here is this system is solidifying its eye wall, and we're likely seeing intensification here as it does so. Current estimates on satellite imagery look to be about 90 knots right now. That's what I would estimate it to be. Could be getting towards major status, at least on the Saffir-Simpson scale that is, but either way, it's a typhoon, and it's very, very close to the Philippines. This will be an extremely close call for Luzon. For the first part of this track, there is a possibility that the system, comes down here very close to Luzon, makes a loop, then comes up towards Luzon. Now there's some uncertainty there. It could come towards Luzon, or it could track towards Taiwan, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. As for what's going on now, this is a microwave pass we got earlier today showing a similar thing that I just described there with the inner core. You can see a very compact core. That's something that is helping this storm intensify fairly quickly. Smaller storms do tend to ramp up pretty quickly, but you can see that strong eye wall wrapping around. Now, something against this system is its small size does make it better to intensify pretty quickly, but it does limit it in the sense that it makes it more sensitive to things like dry air and wind shear. And we might be seeing some impacts of the shear taking shape. You can see that this was the same pass, and throughout the day today, we've seen that this has slowly progressed around the eye wall, but it has seemed to struggle a little bit. Remember yesterday I talked about how there was a microwave pass that I did not show that showed the eye wall is almost completed. Last night we had a pass where it seemed to have been still developing, maybe got a little disrupted, and now today, earlier we had the western side a little bit disrupted overall, and now we're starting to see it try and wrap around again. What I think might be happening here is the system is feeling the effects of some shear. You can see this here from the large ridge that is pushing it south, but it's also, the flow appears a little bit faster than its forward motion. So there is a little bit of shear, and that might cause a little bit of a tilt with structure and with height. And you can see the shear here in the sounding from the GFS. You can see the stronger winds here in the mid to upper levels, and the shear here is about 17 knots. Pretty significant. It's getting to more significant values, and for a smaller storm like this, it's more susceptible to stuff like this. It can be, it can inhibit some intensification. Now, the system right now is not being inhibited overall. It has been, slowed down intensification rate wise in terms of the past day, I'd say. And it certainly has not been able to, say, intensify as fast as maybe it would have if it was in a fully no shear or very low shear environment. But even with the shear, we've really not seen this being overly inhibitive. And this microwave pass is a good example of that. This shear right now, at least for the current situation with the storm, it is not inhibitive. And this storm is likely intensifying fairly significantly here. And this will likely intensify into a pretty strong storm, assuming that this shear does not disrupt this eye wall. The hope would be that we get this system maybe to have the eye wall disrupted more, and we can have the system stay a bit weaker. But even at that, as we get towards the latter half of the forecast, things are supposed to become more and more favorable. And the problem is with this part of the world, there's a lot of deep oceanic heat content here. This system, despite moving slowly here, is not upwelling really any cold water at all. So that means when it makes its secondary pass through here, it's not going to be disrupted by a cold wake. It's going to still have a lot of warm seasonal temperatures and high oceanic heat content. There might, of course, still be some upwelling, but overall, it's not likely to be too significant. Now, if we look at the GFS model for track, we're going to look at the GFS and the European here. There are a few subtle differences in the pattern that we're going to have to watch for over the coming days that will determine whether we have a storm coming into the Philippines or Taiwan, maybe even further north into the islands of Japan. This is a 500 millibar flow map from the GFS and the similar pattern that we talked about yesterday. Here is Damrey and its influence. This is keeping this ridge here from being more southwest, keeping it from pulling the storm north, and this trough way up here is unable to catch this system overall. So the main steering pattern is a 200 millibar ridge. You can see here on the upper levels of the troposphere, and you could see that in the water vapor loop with that stronger flow aloft, and you can see that here, and that's pushing it south. Now, over the coming days, the pattern is going to shift a little bit. Let me go back to the height anomaly map. You can see that Damrey passes offshore of Japan, and as it does so, this ridge back here starts to progress southeastwards. Alongside that, we get increased troughing here over eastern China. And these two features are going to build and work together to bring the storm north, where at 5 days, we have on the GFS a storm going through the islands north of Luzon. The European is a little bit different at day 5. You can see the general pattern is still the same. We have a ridge here with troughing digging in over China. But notice the subtle difference here. The trough base on this run is a little bit farther south than the GFS. There's the Europeans, and I'm going to mark the GFSs. It's a little bit farther south. It's a very subtle difference, but this subtle difference means that on the European model, this trough is ever so slightly farther south and has possibly a little bit more of a northerly pull upon the storm and allows the system to come up here into Taiwan. And we actually have a very strong typhoon making landfall there on the model, while in the GFS, this trough is not as far south, so there's a little less, it's like a hair difference of northerly pull. So now the system sort of starts to make its westward turn and comes south of Taiwan. Now, even in the GFS case, let me make it very clear, you still have significant impacts here, because this is still a very close call here. But you would probably get away in this scenario from the strongest winds in the eye wall. There's a subtle difference that we're just going to have to monitor over the coming days. Now, Pegasa is taking much more of a European approach on this. You can see this generally, as I talked about the general loop here, becoming a super typhoon by early next week on the forecast. Then we see some gradual weakening on track to Taiwan. And that is possible. If it does peak out here, we might have maybe some eye wall replacement cycle take place, and that could weaken the storm a little bit. But even at that, the storm could get larger, and it could intensify maybe a little bit more on approach to Taiwan after the eye wall replacement cycle. We also have the Joint Typhoon Warning Center forecast here. Theirs are a little bit different. They're more of a mean solution between the GFS and the European. You can see coming into southern Taiwan. You can see their forecast is a little bit different as well in intensity. They actually have a super typhoon coming into Taiwan. Now, of course, there is not much difference between a strong typhoon that's maybe 115 to 120 knots, and a super typhoon at 130 to 135 knots coming into Taiwan. You're not going to feel much of a difference there. Either way, the winds are going to be extreme when they come ashore, and we're going to be talking about strong storm surge as well. Now, like I talked about with the GFS, even though it is south, you'll still get impacts most likely, at least in some form, from Taiwan. Similar, think of Doksuri when it came through the islands of Luzon. As the system was south, we had some winds coming north of the system like it's forecast here. Look at how big that wind field is on the forecast there from the Joint Typhoon Warning Center. Alongside that, you get onshore flow into the mountainous terrain. You saw it with Doksuri. You can get very, very heavy rainfall in a short period of time. So even if we have a system coming through the islands of Luzon, you get away from, say, the max winds that could be of super typhoon force, but you still have to deal with rainfall and some gusty winds of tropical storm force, maybe getting towards a significant range of 50 knots or greater. So this is a very significant system. Now, in terms of current watches and warnings, we do have some signal warnings in place from Pagasa. We have a signal 1 warning from about Aurora all the way up into the Luzon Islands here. And for the northeastern tip of Luzon, we have a signal 2 warning. As you can see on their forecast cone, the tropical storm force wind field here is onshore, and there might be maybe a need for some expansion of that if the system does deviate a little bit farther west. You can see that there is still potential for the system to come very close to the coastline. We're not all too likely, I would say, to have a landfall, at least in this part of Luzon. I'm not saying it's impossible. Of course, there is still that off chance it might come very close and make a landfall, but all current guidance has this getting at least very close, closest approach to Luzon. Now, if it does get very close, we could get that typhoon force wind field onshore. So it's very important for those along the coastline of Luzon to just stay tuned to Pagasa. And for those in the rest of the Philippines and the Luzon Islands, in Taiwan, in China, in Japan, stay tuned to the Japan Meteorological Agency and stay tuned to your local weather offices. Like I did yesterday, I will have links in the description so you all can see your local weather offices at the click of a button. That's the Western Pacific, but the Atlantic is also active. It's, again, getting towards peak hurricane season. We have 2 systems that we're monitoring here in the Atlantic. We have Tropical Storm Franklin here north of Puerto Rico, and we have Invest 93L here in the Western Caribbean. I'm going to start off with Invest 93L. And let me find the floater that I have. You can see generally we have some disorganized thunderstorm activity around what appears to be a broad circulation in the Western Caribbean. Now, over the coming days, this system is going to be meandering around here in the Western Caribbean, and development is pretty likely at this point. The National Hurricane Center has raised odds to about 80% over the next several days, 40% within the next 2 days. Really, development is more likely this weekend, maybe towards Sunday, Monday time frame. But here's the European model, and this is the same product that I showed you all yesterday. And you can see the barbs is the 200 millibar flow. The colored contours is 850 millibar vorticity or spin, and the blue contours here is 500 millibar flow height. And you can see there's our general envelope here of vorticity coming up with the monsoon trough. Now, the pattern has shifted since yesterday. The upper ridge is still strung out across the Caribbean, but it is moving now west. And now the center of the ridge aloft is now near Cuba, with this upper low here in the Bay of Campeche backing southwest into Mexico. Now, over the coming days, this ridge is going to help the system, providing a low shear environment. There is still some uncertainty on exactly where does the system sit over the weekend. Does it sit offshore? Does it sit over Mexico? If it does sit offshore, we may have to contend with the possibility of potentially some development earlier on in the forecast. But if it does stay inland a little bit longer, that might delay the time that we see development. But you can see general development take place here regardless as we get into the early part of the week, as this big trough starts to dig in over the United States and pick up Franklin west of Bermuda. But this will start to pick it up. And now we are having some uncertainty on exactly where the system will track once it gets into the Gulf of Mexico. Now, in terms of the European, this has the system at a fairly similar track as yesterday, coming in north of Tampa as a tropical storm. And now the GFS has changed a little bit today, and you'll see that here. It is more similar to the European, showing, yesterday we had a strung out vorticity spread from the Yucatan to the Bahamas, but now we have the GFS showing the vorticity bundling up more, and this would develop into a tropical cyclone on the model. And you can see that here, and you can see the significant difference in the track, coming more into Panama City rather than north of Tampa. So there is a little bit of a track uncertainty there, and it does depend on exactly, how does the system develop. Does it develop in a certain region in the general broad envelope that it has now? That could depict on exactly where it tracks, but also there's this upper low that will help carry it north over the western Gulf of Mexico. The positioning of this and the strength of this may as well change the track, like to where the GFS and the European is. Now, in terms of intensity, of course, I can't get into anything specific because this is far out and we have not had a system develop yet. But as I talked about yesterday, and I'll go to the 200 millibar flow so you can see it better, the forecast is for this system to have a fairly favorable environment overall once it gets into the Gulf of Mexico. Right now, it has that upper ridge over the Caribbean. That's a fairly favorable look right now, but even as it gets into the Gulf of Mexico, this system will likely have a favorable environment overall. And you can see that here on the GFS with this large band of anticyclonic flow aloft. Now, in this sense, we could actually absolutely get some intensification. The GFS does do this. The GFS is coming in aggressive. In fact, it puts it, I think, to a hurricane up towards the coastline. And this is absolutely possible. It is possible that we get a hurricane coming into Florida. I'd say this, as of right now, is the reasonable worst case scenario. I'd say the more likely scenario is that we have a tropical storm coming into Florida. Exact intensity, again, I can't get into the exact specifics there. But something that also might help it as it gets towards the coastline is you notice this jet streak that we talked about yesterday over the United States, over the Ohio Valley into the mid-Atlantic. In a scenario where the system is in a good position relative to this jet streak, it could enhance the outflow and we could get significant intensification there if it does, have enough time to do so. If it starts helping it towards landfall, we likely wouldn't be seeing too much. Similarly to Harold, some good news here is that this system will likely not have too much time over the Gulf of Mexico once it gets in. And you can see that here on the GFS. It gets into the Gulf on Tuesday morning, and by Wednesday morning, it's at the panhandle of Florida on this forecast. The European has it in the Gulf of Mexico at the same time Tuesday morning, coming into the Big Bend on Wednesday morning as well. So we have generally about a day, maybe a day or a little more over the Gulf of Mexico. That's not a lot of time. Now, keep in mind, Harold had about a day or two to develop in the Gulf of Mexico, and we had a significant tropical storm coming into the Texas coastline. So we could absolutely still get an intensifying tropical storm here, but I'd say a reasonable worst case scenario right now would be the system becomes a hurricane just before coming ashore. Regardless of that, we're still likely to see some strong winds here of tropical storm force along the coastline of Florida. And we're likely to see some storm surge issues as well. And even west of the track, we are likely to see some rip current issues. And if the track does come like this, you would likely still have some beach issues along the coastline of Mississippi, Alabama, and the panhandle of Florida. But of course, as the system takes the GFS track and comes to the panhandle, we might have some more tropical storm conditions there. Now, after the panhandle or peninsula of Florida, the system is forecast to track northeast under the influence of this trough that is dug in, and we will likely see some impacts spread across the entire southeastern United States and the mid-Atlantic. And we could see some, tropical storm force winds. And if it does come offshore, there might be some potential that it re-strengthens as the Gulf Stream is very warm this time of year. It's about 30 degrees Celsius along the Gulf Stream. But there might be an issue of more shear as well. That's a bit uncertain. We'll have to see exactly how things go over the next couple of days before we start talking about impacts there. But for those along the southeastern United States and in Cuba and in Mexico, make sure you stay tuned to the National Hurricane Center. They're going to have tropical weather outlooks every 6 hours from 2 p.m., 8 p.m., 2 a.m., and 8 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. And those will get issued with formation chances there. You can see where 93.0 is, 80% chance. And as soon as it forms, they're of course going to have advisories out. So make sure you stay tuned to those advisories as it comes out. And of course, I'm going to have future videos throughout the weekend and into next week. Final system we're going to be talking about is Tropical Storm Franklin here north of Puerto Rico. And this system is looking very bad today compared to yesterday. Remember yesterday we had the system, it was sheared, but the general center was on the western end of the convection. Today we've seen a significant decoupling from the mid-level center in convection and a low-level center. You can see the low-level center is here, and all the convection is down here near the U.S. Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. This is pretty significant, and the shear has increased today as the ridge has started to back west, maybe even a bit more than some models had anticipated. But alongside that, we have this developing trough here that is bringing some of that increased westerly shear, and this will likely inhibit any intensification over the next day or so for Franklin right now. Recon has flown in there. We've had 2 planes go through this afternoon. They found the center where you would expect it from satellite imagery, and the tropical storm force winds here are extending all the way out here in the convection, and that still has about 50-mile-per-hour winds. There's about 45 knots associated with it. So Franklin is not looking the best, but despite the things today, things are still looking pretty favorable later in the weekend and into next week as the system tracks north. You can see as we get into Saturday, the upper trough continues to develop, and we get this large upper low north of Hispaniola. And now, rather than having a strong westerly shear upon the storm, we have now southerly push and more anticyclonic flow aloft, spreading away from the storm. Now, you might ask if this would be a shear here because you have southerly flow here, and this might be a little bit of a shear, but it wouldn't be too significant because the steering vector is generally in line with the shearing vector. So this nets in not too strong of a shear, and I can show you that if I look at the GFS here. You can see that shear is generally low here at about 10 knots, and you can see here's that flow from the upper low, and you can see in general we have the main steering flow being northerly, but there might be some shear because there is some easterly winds in the southern part of the troposphere, or the lowest part of the troposphere rather, but you can see the main shear here not high at all, and by this point we're likely to see the system intensify, and the GFS and European, really all global models agree that the system will intensify quite significantly, and you can see by the time we get to early next week, this is a very favorable upper level pattern over Franklin, and I would still not be surprised to see this thing make a run at major hurricane intensity before it starts to weaken northwest of Bermuda. Now, in terms of Bermuda, we still have confidence today that the system will not make landfall in Bermuda. In fact, you are now out of the cone. Guidance continues to suggest that the system will still stay west of the island, but keep in mind, the system could still deviate a little bit east on this cone, and we could still get maybe some more adverse impacts here. And even if it does take this track, the center track the National Hurricane Center has, you can still have some significant impacts here. You can see still significant 30 to 40% odds of tropical storm force winds there. The arrival time has been pushed back a little bit to Monday morning, so you have about a whole day longer to prepare ahead of the storm. And you can see there will be some significant wave issues for Bermuda and rip current issues along the entire coastline of the United States. And the system is forecast to come up towards Atlantic Canada. There is still some uncertainty here on exactly how far north or south it will be, but either way, some impacts do appear likely, especially for the coastline of Atlantic Canada. And for those there, make sure you stay tuned to the Canadian Hurricane Center for the latest information there. And for Bermuda, stay tuned to the Bermuda Weather Service and the National Hurricane Center advisories. And for those along the entire East Coast wondering about rip currents, look towards your local National Weather Service offices. They typically have graphics on rip current issues that happen throughout the year. That's an active tropics, and that was a lot to talk about. I will have timestamps again like I did yesterday for all these. But stay safe in the Philippines and every area really that I talked about today that's going to be impacted by some tropical systems this week. I'll have future videos this weekend and through next week, but stay safe, and that's it for now. Thanks for watching.